Welcome to Corrections Mama 27 channel. So there was a accidental discharge at the hospital from Lewis Complex, a Lewis Complex officer. Now this happens from time to time. Is it acceptable? No, it's not. It's not okay. This officer probably will keep his job if they report it, and they're likely to get disciplinary. And I'm going to go through how this can happen. So I'm going to use my Walther because it has a slide. What they use is a Glock, but the Walther is similar, but it's not a Glock. But it has a slide and a certain mechanism that I'll be able to show you what likely happened. So in my experience, first of all, the first thing that happened that went wrong in the weapons exchange, this happened during a weapons exchange, most likely in the bathroom. I don't know if they have, I don't believe they have gun barrels in the hospital for weapons exchange. They didn't when I worked there. That may have changed. But regardless, when there's an accidental discharge, that always means somebody has their finger on the trigger. You cannot make a gun go off unless you pull the trigger. And the only way you can pull the trigger is with your finger, so somebody must have had their finger in the trigger. Whether it was the person leaving shift and giving their gun up, or if it was the officer receiving the gun. The only way it could be the officer receiving the gun that had their finger on the trigger would have been if the officer being relieved did not unload the weapon and handed the gun over to the other officer loaded. That is not supposed to happen. When you exchange weapons, you're supposed to clear the weapon completely. So I'm going to explain how that happens and how you're supposed to do that. So we're going to pretend this is a Glock. It's a Walther. It's not a Glock, but we'll pretend for video purposes. So I'm going to turn the gun around this way, and this button right here, you can see that it releases the magazine down here. This button here locks the slide back. This is the slide. So I'm going to, with my finger here, straight across the barrel. It's not here. Some people tend to grab a gun like this. That is not the safe or proper way to hold a gun. This is the safest, most proper way. Now, some people like to hold it like this. The reason why I don't hold it that way is because you are getting in the habit of having your trigger finger, curled around the gun, which could lead to this, which we don't want. You want your finger here on the barrel. Then I'm going to release the magazine. Now this magazine, as you can see, I'm going to do that so you can kind of see it's silver all the way down. Now on a Glock magazine, I believe you can see it on this side, and there's 45 rounds, but there are little holes, and you can tell by pushing this down, and you can see them move. But you could also, if a trained eye looks at it, you can tell that it is completely full. So this is the number 2 mistake people make, is the gun is hot, but they think because they've dropped the magazine that it's clear. It is not. It's hot. At work, in the Department of Corrections, they require you to carry your weapon hot, which means you have ammunition in the gun barrel, which means you do not have to pull the slide back to load it in the barrel. You pull the trigger and it shoots. You're shooting the weapon. So I always keep it hot with a full magazine, which means I have the magazine in. I pull the slide back, let it retreat. Then I pull the magazine out and get a fresh magazine with 45 rounds, not 44, and pop it in. That way I have one extra bullet just in case, right? Just in case you might need it. So I'm going to put my thumb here, all right, and I'm going to pull the slide back. Push up on the slide and it locks it back. Now, you should have heard or seen the bullet drop through here. It'll usually drop through here. Sometimes it'll drop through here, depending on how you're holding the weapon. So, where did it go? It's right here. Let me pick it up 1 second. So here's the extra round. So this is what I believe happened. The officer either handed the other officer, to be lazy, a loaded gun. Shouldn't do that. Or dropped the magazine, assumed it was, clear, and it wasn't. The only way you can tell it's clear is if the slide is back and you look in there, you can see, put your finger in there, there is no ammunition in there. So he must have had his finger on the trigger, whether there was magazine out and one in the chamber, or he loaded it. And when he loaded it, you can load it like this, put the magazine in. This is the best, fastest way to do it. Then you pull the slide back and it's going to chamber around. He could have had his finger on the trigger like this and pulled the slide back, which loaded it and eventually shot it. So when you pull this back, you're putting pressure and working against this hand. So this, if your finger's on the trigger, this hand may easily pull the trigger, because you're gonna have to resist a little bit to put enough pressure on this slide to pull it back. And then when it came forward, he pulled the trigger. So again, I'm telling you, I didn't know how this happened. I was not there. But this isn't the first time it's happened. The number one way it happens is by weapons exchange. The person has a finger on the trigger. Never do that. Always reserve it like this. And the person should always receive an empty weapon. The magazine down, out, and your slide back, and you should be able to make sure it's clear. Your weapon should always be clear when you hand it off to somebody. And I do this not only at work, but I would also do this at home. If I was to hand off a weapon to my husband or something, I would clear it first and give it to him. That's the proper way to do it. Hopefully, I don't believe anyone died or was shot. And you also need to always point your weapon in a safe direction. Now, for me, this area, this direction is a safe direction because there's no homes behind me. There's this pool house here. It's going to go into that, or it's going to go out into the field. In the hospital situation, probably the best place to point it would be the floor. Some people would say the ceiling. I would say no, because you could lean it this way or this way and shoot somebody in the face. So you don't want to do that. I'm going to make this weapon clear while I make a demonstration. So you want to point it at the floor. In my opinion, it's probably the best place, in the best direction to point a weapon when you're in a building and there is no other thing. Now, is 100%? No. What's 100% is you have your finger off the trigger. That's 100%. But if you do shoot it accidentally, then it may ricochet off the floor, but it's not going to go through drywall and kill somebody. It could go through the floor if you're not on the first floor. Of course, there's always a chance it could, but I doubt it'll penetrate that far. It'll probably, the bullet would probably, on impact of the floor, would be damaged, and hopefully it doesn't hit anybody. So, and the ceiling is just a bad idea, because as you can see, if you tip it this way, I'm going to shoot you. If you tip it a little this way, I'm going to shoot myself. So the best place is at the floor, maybe in a corner or something. So that's how you should be exchanging weapons. So one of three things happened. The gun was handed over to an officer and it wasn't clear. In that case, that officer that handed the gun over and didn't follow procedure and clear it is probably going to get disciplinary right along with the guy that shot accidentally the weapon. And that officer that he gave the weapon to took the weapon like this and not like this. And so then he accidentally pulled the trigger. Or he put the magazine in, it was making it hot, and he had his finger on the trigger and pulled the trigger. So the bottom line is he had his finger on the trigger, which you shouldn't do. So that's probably how it happened. Or it could have been the officer that was clearing the gun. He could have had his finger on the trigger, dropped the magazine, and pulled the slide back. And I've also seen officers drop the magazine and think that they need to pull the trigger to clear it. You don't pull the trigger to clear a weapon. That's the most unsafe thing to do. When you have a gun barrel, you don't pull the trigger to clear it. That's a waste of ammunition. It's just for safety. It's just for a safe place to point your weapon when you're clearing it. So there could have been a few scenarios that caused this. But I'm telling you, probably both officers may get in trouble for this unless the one officer that received the weapon takes full responsibility, or the officer that had the weapon before he gave it over takes full responsibility for what happened. But I've seen people in the hospital not want to clear the gun because they're scared, and they just hand it over to the next guy. Wrong. You're not supposed to do that. You still should be clearing your weapon. And then you can also keep the slide back and you put the magazine in and then load the chamber. But because I've done that already, I dropped one, I've got to add one. All right, put it in, pull it back. It should be loaded now. Now I can take this magazine out. Now there's still one in the chamber here. And if it loaded, I should be able, which I can tell it was because this is pushed forward, I should be able to put one in the magazine. So this weapon is hot. It's ready to go, which is how I always carry. Then you put it in your holster. Hopefully you have a holster with some kind of safety mechanism so it can't be just pulled out. And then you're good to go. So if you want to avoid any accidents, follow those directions. Never receive a gun that hasn't been cleared. Never put your finger on the trigger. Never, ever, ever. Unless you're pointing at a target and you're going to shoot somebody, or you think you're going to shoot somebody. Because it's important how you remember that you remember. And if you have bad habits and you know you have a bad habit of putting your finger on the trigger when receiving a gun, some people will, like this, you cannot put your finger on the trigger when pulling your weapon out. Most holsters do have a safety thing where you can't put your finger on the trigger and pull it up. This has a button that you push in and pull out. But you should always have it like this. So that's your gun safety lesson for today. If you are an officer or a regular person, never receive a gun that is loaded. Make sure it is clear. Never put your finger on the trigger, whether you're receiving it or whether you're clearing it or you're in possession of it. There's no need to put your finger on the trigger for any reason unless you're going to shoot. That's all for today. Please like, share, subscribe. Appreciate your views.